Okay. So, the recording is now on. Another reminder to keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. Questions can be typed into the chat, which will remain on during Dustin's talk. So you can type them as you think of them, but we won't ask them till the end. Or you can use the hand icon after Dustin's finished speaking to ask the speaker directly. Because I find my voice tedious at the best of times, I will invite you to ask your question out loud, even if you've typed it. Please indicate in the chat if you'd prefer that I pose the question to the speaker on your behalf. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's introducer. Courtney Weiss Smith is an associate professor in the Department of English, and I've forgotten where, at Wesleyan. I'm so used to, I didn't even type it out, at Wesleyan. And she's also the associate editor of History and Theory, where she's speaking to us today from the terribly constructed sentence. Her first book, Empiricist Devotions, Science, Religion, and Poetry in the Early 18th Century England, from University of Virginia Press in 2016, won the Walker Cohen Memorial Prize for Outstanding Scholarship in 18th Century Studies. Her current project, Sound Stuff, Words in Enlightenment, Philosophy, and Poetics, is a history of ideas about poetic sound, including rhyme, onomatopoeia, and pun, the lowest but best of all forms of humor. The project explores how poets, but also philosophers and natural philosophers, understood the material forms that words took. And she will be introducing our speaker today. So Courtney, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Elaine. It is my true pleasure to introduce today my friend, Dustin Stewart, Assistant Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. His first book, Futures of Enlightenment Poetry, was published by Oxford University Press in 2020 and won the American Society for 18th Century Studies Louis Gottschalk Prize for the year's best scholarly book on an 18th century topic. If you haven't read this book, go do it now. It has changed how I think about both the 18th century and contemporary poetics. Dustin traces two different ways that Protestant Christianity understood the afterlife in the period. The soul will break free of its body, but also God will raise the dead into better versions of body. And these two orientations to the afterlife inspire 18th century poets to two different understandings of poetry, poetics. And then, provocatively, Dustin shows that these Enlightenment orientations to poetics persist as energies in secularized poetics today, in Tracy K. Smith and Alice Oswald's say. Poetry as spiritual, as offering practice in being a spirit, or mortalist, finding significance in the embodied realities of every day. This summary does not capture the best part of Dustin's book. The best part is in Dustin's gorgeous, penetrating close readings of individual poems. As a fan of his writing, I've been excited to see what Dustin gets into next. I know he's been thinking about Aruba Kogano's Black Calvinism, his essay is out in ELH, but also about Tom Gunn's Queer California Reimagining of the 18th century couplet, Bruno Latour's religious writing, and Gilbert White's obsession with birds' nests. The sheer range of these topics, handled always with a signature eye for precise detail, is a testament to Dustin as a thinker and a reader and a writer. I am so excited to hear what promises to be a brilliant talk today. Join me in welcoming Dustin Stewart to give his talk, From the Parish to the Planet, Reimagining Space with Gilbert White.
Well, thanks, Courtney, for that that blush-inducing introduction. Greetings from Manhattan. A warm thanks to Elaine for convening the seminar, doing all the work involved, and inviting me to participate. I'm grateful for your attendance at what is, for me and probably for you too, a tough time of year, approaching the end of a spring term, probably a teaching term for many of you. I can at least promise that part of my content should feel seasonally appropriate. No marshmallow bunnies or candy-coated chocolates, but a few strategically placed Easter eggs, even so. I'd like to share with you today some work in progress on shifting ideas about the parish, the basic unit of local administration and church government. What kind of territory was a parish in the 18th century? Here are a few pages from the project's introduction that summarize two interrelated models and then set out my case that Gilbert White, beloved naturalist and Anglican curate, offers a third way. The traditional placemaking model took the form of a procession held during Rogationtide, part of the springtime liturgical calendar that follows Easter. We're into seasonal specificity now, and culminates in a feast celebrating the resurrected Christ's ascension to heaven. Residents gathered to identify the limits of their parish, affirming the community's solidarity while marching along its bounds in a perambulation that could take several days to complete. Processionaries sang songs and chanted passages from the Bible. They lifted up prayers, asking for God's blessing on local crops and divine protection from external threats. And they pulled down fences, protesting enclosures and asserting their rights to the customary path, rights at least cautiously acknowledged by law through the end of the 18th century. That's E.P. Thompson. Older residents relayed their mental maps to younger ones. Signage might have made the job simpler, but marchers most often relied on natural rather than man-made landmarks in following the route. Trees, streams, and hedgerows, for example, were especially prized as guideposts. That's from historian Steve Hendel. In this model then, a traditional model I'm calling it, some other than human beings do help to ratify parish boundaries, but they can only contribute by staying stationary. Even the streams are expected to behave like trees, remaining firmly rooted. They point the way for the humans, whose embodied action formally circumscribes the parish and makes it, or rather keeps it, a place. Lives that aren't human can indispensably belong, to be sure, but their value seems to depend on the strength of their grip. By clutching the same spot while those meandering humans pass by them, one generation after another, they make the landscape predictable and reassuringly stable. A modernizing variation on this traditional model ran with the idea that it's human bodies that determine a parish's edge. Partly because increasing numbers of people were spending extended time away from their parishes in the 18th century, residency and belonging felt less and less synonymous. On the one hand, some occupants of a given parish weren't seen as technically settled there and didn't fully belong. Maybe they hadn't been born in the area or worked or rented property there for long enough. Their access to parochial benefits, from monetary relief or medical help to the use of common land and common fuel, remained limited unless and until they became naturalized. On the other hand, not everyone who formally belonged to a parish dwelled inside its dimensions as usually imagined. As historian Keith Snell has explained, even as the period's shifting picture of parochial space sometimes excluded certain residents, it also, and here I'm quoting, flowed beyond the parish to encompass people in the country or the world who belonged to it. In this revised model, a perimeter that had already been associated with human walking, human movement, can be imagined as branching out in multiple further directions as some human bodies, the indispensable ones, the ones recognized as belonging, relocate for a time. The second model doesn't, however, jettison the first. The Rogationtide procession continued to occur in plenty of places back then, just as it still happens in a few parishes today. So it might make sense in expounding the modernizing model proposed by Snell to distinguish between a single primary loop and numerous secondary loops. The primary loop is the customary parish boundary, ratified through long-term ritual practice and local memory, and secondary loops supplement it by springing out of it, curving outward to follow individual parishioners or families as they leave, and then bending back with them as they return. Instead of crossing outside the parish, these sojourners could be thought of as continuing to participate in its perambulatory flow. Extra-parochial mobility could now be visualized as changing a parish's shape, plying its far edge toward new spaces. For secondary loops to enfold some people in their absence, though, their movements had to be recognized by others who remained in a primary loop back home, people with their own secure claims to the place. A secondary loop refers, that is, not only to a route being traveled, but to an active attachment, an ongoing relation of care or concern, uniting the traveler who goes to the parishioners who stay. This updated model portrays the extension of the parish as an imaginative and social practice. By making boundaries more obviously flexible things, it allows parochial belonging to persist at a distance. It draws on the power of religious ritual to make the far away feel close. It makes the magic of local attachment feel portable. Yet the model gains its expansiveness by untethering human movement from terrain. Secondary loops appear to dispense with any need for landmarks, releasing parishioners from their entanglement with the other than human presences, trees, streams, hedgerows, that stabilize the primary loop. Those physical formations, meanwhile, are presumed to remain anchored to their traditional places, regardless of how much they ripple or flow. The modernized model doesn't treat them as mobile any more than the traditional one does. And although the newer model regards affiliation as an alternative to physical proximity for certain human beings, a sufficiently durable link between the people who belong at home and the indispensable ones who can belong from afar, it doesn't seem to accept that similar bonds might knit human beings together with other forms of earthly life across vast distances. My project tries to reconstruct a third option, a relational theory of mobile belonging from the late 18th century. This third way retains the traditional model's assumption that a perambulation requires both human and non-human contributors, while also accepting the modernized model's amendment that secondary loops can pull the parish as a territory away, possibly very far away from familiar local ground. The theory distinguishes itself by playing up the simple, even homely truths that non-human creatures also have other places to go and are also cared about while they're gone. It tries to imagine how far the boundaries might extend in embracing birds that are accepted as members of a parish and that during their wintertime absence remain present to the place, thanks in part to the ritually renewed curiosity and fondness of human observers there. The mental map of the parish assumes a new shape as it slopes outward in curves, secondary loops, traced by avian bodies on the move. In this instance of bordering as an interspecies practice, affiliation begins well below and then reaches considerably beyond the boundaries of the nation. Gilbert White, a pioneering natural historian, stands as my case study. Parochial space supplies observational space for White, as Brooke and Carey has stressed lately, a local patch in which the natural world may be studied and puzzled over. For most of his life, White lived in Selborne, a secluded rural parish in Hampshire, and he closely monitored and meticulously documented its flora and fauna for decades on end, and became an inspiration for later amateur naturalists and recreational birders. But even if scholarship has until recently tended to downplay his Anglicanism, White was by profession a clergyman in the Church of England, and his defense of distant belonging shows that extending parish boundaries can be every bit as religious an endeavor as marching along the perimeter and singing psalms or hymns during Rogation days. In the Natural History of Selborne, initially published in 1789, the parson-naturalist relies on religious vocabularies at two decisive moments in the process of reimagining the parish so that it embraces his favorite birds wherever they go. The first moment depends on ecclesiological categories to account for antisocial avian species that nest at a near distance. The second moment uses biblical visions of angels and a theology of incarnation to keep untold numbers of birds in the parochial loop once they withdraw, possibly flying to sites that White sees as forbiddingly remote, as far away from his hilly part of Hampshire as equatorial Africa. I say possibly flying far away. Gilbert White's favorite birds were migratory, but he didn't know that. Or rather, he knew they might be migratory, but couldn't decide for sure. He was deeply attached to the swallows, martins, and swifts that spent part of each year in Selborne. I follow White in referring to these birds collectively as hirundines, even though the swift has since been assigned to a different biological family. Selborne is made up of letters written by the author to two contemporaries, natural historian Thomas Pennant and naturalist Daines Barrington. And despite its loose structure, shifting from one carefully observed local phenomenon to another, the book really finds its focus in an ongoing debate about whether hirundines migrate or hibernate for the winter. The science was altogether unresolved at the time. What Tobias Menley calls White's remarkably objective response consists of keeping both options genuinely open. The parson-naturalist grants that most of these birds probably retreat to the milder weather of tropical Africa. At the same time, he accepts that some might turn torpid and hide for the coldest months in low-lying shrubs nearby, in the area's church towers, or, as no less an authority than Carl Linnaeus guessed, underneath local waterways. White writes from the knowledge that he can't know whether their disappearance keeps them in the vicinity or takes them thousands of miles away. Modern critics sometimes suppose, however, that his view of the birds as belonging to his parish precludes any real objectivity. His great biographer, for example, faults White for assuming that the martins he witnesses in Selborne are in fact Selborne's martins. The martins concerned, Richard Mabey retorts, were almost certainly not Selborne birds at all, but part of one of the migratory streams of birds that move slowly across Britain throughout the autumn. Migratory birds can't belong to any single locality, Mabey figures, and White must have grown too fond of swallows, martins, and swifts to attach to them, to see the truth about their annual departures. He must have wanted to believe they stay nearby. But this sort of criticism assumes that the space of a parish precedes and exists altogether independently of its parishioners. As the book that White calls a parochial history condenses his long-term effort to chart the movements of hirundines, mapping possible migratory routes and digging for secret hibernation shafts, communicating with fellow observers at home, as well as experts and eyewitnesses abroad, the rapport that humans establish with these birds has the effect of modifying their parish's dimensions. Between them, whether with small loops or large, the humans and the birds extend parochial space. So that's the overall picture in 2,000 words. In my remaining time, I think I have some more time to fill. In my remaining time, I'd like to share a few segments from different sections of the piece, adding up to around 2,500 more words that show how I try to use examples in weaving this thread through birds, religion, and extendable space. The first part I want to share is from a section that emphasizes White's use of the terms dissenter and dissenting to describe swifts and sand martins, the two species of hirundine that don't mix very well with each other or with humans, and that keep their distance from the village. This aloofness on the part of swifts and sand martins is set in contrast in the book to the cozy familiarity of the chimney swallows and house martins, who, according to White, only seem comfortable when nestled nearby human beings. My point is that parochial space turns out to rely on the group of birds that seems more detached, less lovable. White almost certainly wouldn't refer to the outlier birds as dissenting without having the live ecclesiological charge of that word in mind. Dissenters were Protestant Christians who refused to conform to the Church of England as restored by law in 1660 to 1662, after decades of civil war, and who gathered in their own chapels or small meeting houses rather than flocking as the law normally demanded, to the established churches of the vast Anglican majority. Dissenters had won new civil and religious protections under the Toleration Act and welcomed the new promise of legitimacy and political opportunity afforded by the Hanoverian succession. But their subsequent growth in the 18th century was strongly associated with the towns and not the country. And Gilbert White lived in a rural place that felt isolated from the ongoing history, often overhyped or oversimplified by later interpreters anyway, of increasingly close integration between dissenters and the wider culture. For all he knew, and we have some of his ecclesiastical records, White's ministry did not have any dissenting humans to serve. Yet the analogies in his Natural History give him some of the avian variety. Swifts and sand martins are to swallows and house martins, he implies, as dissenters are to Anglicans. The dissenting birds remain in their strictly defined, sectarian-seeming enclaves. They can strike observers as odd, quirky at a minimum, and otherworldly at their most extreme. By contrast, the familiar birds that amiably congregate with humans and share in everyday human practices could perhaps be thought to embody an inclusive vision of religious community, a big tent interspecies establishment. Such an idea of inclusiveness, though, requires any potential participant to vacate the margins, places closer to the parish's edge, and move to the center, a village defined above all by its human presence. Strangers on this view must come into the tent. It won't come out to them. In Selborne, White tries to rehabilitate the concept of comprehension on a local level while he naturalizes dissent. He activates a traditional understanding of the parish as a territory marked by bodies in motion. It isn't reducible to human bodies settled in human spaces. It's confined neither to the people who gather for worship in the local Anglican church on any given Sunday, nor to the roster of human inhabitants of the village surrounding that place of worship. If the parish embraces non-human life, it doesn't need to stop with the beings that enjoy congregating with humans in the settled area, or to require other creatures to come inward to the village, to join the hug, as it were, on their own initiative. And yet the parish for him doesn't seem straightforwardly identical with a fixed perimeter either. Comprehension moves from the inside out, from the center toward the peripheries of the parish. In a way, White's explorations give the parish its peripheries, establishing them and renewing them by regular observation. He vacates the area inhabited by humans and domesticated hirundines, proceeding horizontally as well as vertically, to pursue the dissenters, the swifts and sand martins. He looks for the birds that don't come looking for him. As Maybe notes, White's hands-on method involves, among other tactics, walking down to waterways, scaling buildings by ladder or asking younger helpers to scale them, digging with his spades and peering through his telescope. Following his observational movements that themselves follow elusive avian movements, the dimensions of Selborne's primary loop meander to lakes and streams, press down underground, waft up into the sky. The search is a kind of dance between human and bird that actively remakes the place. Sand martins and swifts co-create the parish not by congregating with people, in short, but by not congregating with them. But that's only because White does the co-creative work of perambulating after them, trying to make sense of them in their separateness, their inaccessible yet partially observable modes of congregating, and also communicating with other people about them, socially sealing these birds as indispensable. This is how he comprehends them religiously, even when he can't fully comprehend them epistemologically. The outliers may, it's true, make it harder for him to be attached to them, but White seems drawn to their repulsion. He seems to need, for his field of ministerial and scientific labor, the distance they seem to need from him. And not just him. These dissenters in Selborne confirm that some birds stay as divided from closely related avian species as they do from human beings. What I've just been sharing is material from a section on belonging at a near distance. Here's the opening of the next section, which is on belonging at a possibly far distance. Gilbert White builds hiddenness into his working theory of the parish when writing about the Hirondines he calls dissenters, sand martins and swifts. Unlike the gregarious and affable house martins and swallows, birds that seem most comfortable in the company of humans, their nests open to human beings and grafted onto or inside of human dwellings, dissenting birds keep their distance and keep their secrets, even as they make their presence felt in the parish during the nesting and fledging months. Once the Hirondines begin to disappear for the winter, either, as White understood the options, by hibernating in some secret local space, or by navigating long distances to uncharted warmer lands, the mysterious reserve he at first associates with the dissenting birds also comes to characterize the familiar domesticated ones. All hirondines hide in the wintertime. All become detached or estranged. All of them dissent in some way. Their seasonal withdrawal is temporally bound by two endpoints. On the front side, White considers their departure, either, as he sees it, a going or a staying. The idea of their staying strikes him as more plausible, while their going demands some imaginative help that he ends up receiving from biblical language about angels. On the back end, he reckons with the Hirondines' return. He operates on the assumption that the birds that appear in Selborne each spring are actually reappearing. He thinks they recognize the place and want to re-inhabit the cavity nests they've previously built in it. He is quick to identify any possible proof that, and I'm quoting, the same birds return to the same spots in the local environment. Retrospectively, these birds can be acknowledged as carrying their parochial belonging with them during the intervening months, the stretch between their departure and their return. White's commitment to holding hibernation and migration open as legitimate possibilities means that faced with a single returning hirondine in the spring, a single bird rematerializing, he can't say where or how far it's been. He can't know whether this returner is, in a distinction I develop in the piece, a flyer or a straggler. I want to jump to the part about the springtime reappearance of the birds, the moment when these birds return in the spring. What you need to know from the parts that I'm skipping over is this. White subtly incorporates biblical terminology about angels in the process of overcoming some of his qualms about the theory of migration. The hint that these tiny little birds, the domesticated ones, the familiar ones, the cute ones, the hint that they assume some kind of angelic power in the autumn, just as they prepare to depart, seems to make him feel better about their capacity for long distance migratory flight. He sort of relies on religious language in this way to make migration, which he intellectually knows is possible, emotionally or effectively feel right. Yet he doesn't use that move to conclude that all of the birds fly away. Instead, he resolves that most do, whereas some probably don't. Some, he says, stay behind. He sets up, in other words, a majority-minority relationship between the groups I refer to as flyers, those that migrate, and stragglers, those that hibernate either in the parish or not too far outside its primary loop. White is convinced that hirondines prefer to come back to the local areas they know and, to the extent possible, reoccupy previously built nests after the annual migration or hibernation period is over. Same birds, same spots. By no means all of them come back, however. In his detailed account of the house martins, White concedes that withdrawing, either near or far, may be tantamount to dying. I'm quoting, unless these birds are very short-lived indeed, or unless they do not return to the district where they are bred, they must undergo vast devastations somehow and somewhere. For the birds that return yearly bear no manner of proportion to the birds that return. The birds that return yearly bear no manner of proportion to the birds that retire. Modest numbers tallied in Selborne early each spring, considerably smaller than the uncountable figure for the angelic host that departs in the fall, force him to confront the strong possibility of vast devastations during the intervening winter months. So as well as heralding new birth, spring brings proof, countable proof of enormous loss. This simultaneity crystallizes in White's tendency to associate the arrival of the Herondians with the coming of Easter, seasonally appropriate material. It was entirely conventional to reflect that these two events occur around the same time of year, but White's storehouse of precisely dated notes can make them nearly overlap. I give some examples. No matter where any given hirundine has been before it reappears during Eastertide, the bird has somehow found a way to defeat death, as though in coming back it has, like the Christ of the gospel stories, risen from the grave. On White's exactingly inconclusive terms, it's not necessary to assume that vast devastations beset only one group or the other. Great losses may strike both flyers and stragglers in similar proportions. And that possibility ends up minimizing the difference between them, large-scale death acting as a kind of unifier for those still living. It resets the majority-minority relationship that obtained at the time of their autumnal departure. The deceased birds, the ones that don't come back, now form the majority. And by virtue of reappearing at all, by virtue of surviving, the birds that are visible in the spring compose a new minority. Because White commits to migration and hibernation as concurrent realities, not just one or the other, but possibly both at once, he is left to see a reappearing hirundine as undecidedly a straggler or a flyer, and possibly in effect as both at once. He can glimpse two possible versions of a single bird as entangled, phenomenologically inseparable, if you like. A house martin that arrives in the village around Easter, a few weeks before it begins building or touching up its impressive spherical nest, might have recently awakened from a long winter's nap in, I'm quoting White again, the next church, ruin, chalk cliff, steep covert, or perhaps sandbank, lake, or pool. There's no end to hiding places nearby. Or else, though, equally as viably, the bird might be a weary pilgrim that has just completed the last leg of an astonishing round-trip journey to Africa. For White or his correspondents, or for readers sharing or recreating White's terms of observational engagement, each potential rendering of this bird, each picture of the bird as a traveler, can reinforce the other option. Each can readily slip into the other or be taken for the other, accepting that a slow-moving, yawning bird could truly be either a straggler or a flyer means approaching it and admiring it as both simultaneously. But these two backstories, both plausible, are constituted and made interchangeable by a desolate third option, the plot of devastation that White sees unfolding for a new invisible majority of hirundines that also disappeared the previous October or November. This new majority never stops hiding. White's view of the Easter holiday gains a more complex application in this light. One sort of bird defined by its physical limitations and its resulting geographic narrowness, a straggler, converges in the mind of the observer with another type of bird, a flyer, that may look identical but has overcome those limitations and gained some sort of heavenly power that facilitates long-distance migration. Weakness and strength now prove hard to distinguish. A returner that strikes White as feeble or immature might only conditionally or provisionally be so. It's possible that the same bird or its parents or even the whole family might recently have been unthinkably strong and may become unthinkably strong again soon. All the informed observer may feel prepared to say for certain at this point is that this bird, a strong, weak bird, is alive and not dead. But even that conclusion wavers when reading White. Death forms a necessary part of the doctrine of Christ's incarnation. Christian theologians often talk about kenosis, a term for Christ's self-sacrifice, his forfeiture of divine standing in the act of becoming human and being crucified. The life of God, one of them says, God's truth or God's power, manifests itself in the death of Jesus, and not only in his resurrection. Recently, a few theorists have updated the long tradition of kenotic thinking to expound what they call deep incarnation, by analogy to deep ecology. White's 18th century spin on deep incarnation takes the birds he's already associated with kenosis in one sense, birds for which heavenly strength both ascends from and dips back down to humble local weakness. And then he folds in another associative layer. Because the triumphant Christ who rises is the same Christ who suffers and dies, White subtly encourages the thought that the birds that return to Selborne at Easter should be regarded as spiritually or effectively equivalent to the ones that don't return. Each hirundine that survives carries with it numerous others that don't make it back. The invisible majority is representable through, at once buried and resurrected in, the visible minority that lives on. So White's strong, weak birds are also, from this perspective, living dead birds. Kenosis, a theory of multiple identities, is equally a theory of separate places. God's heavenly place and humanity's earthly place may be distinguishable, but they exist in dynamic mutuality, each open to the other, and each defined by flows into and out of the other. This is a certain kind of, a spatial kind of theological thinking. And White relies on this kind of theological thinking about the incarnation, even as he wants to eminentize it, even as he wants to bring the heaven-earth relation itself down to earth. His near-far birds don't leave Selborne when withdrawing because Selborne itself changes shape, partly in relation to them, whether they hibernate close to the primary loop of human and avian activity, or they forge secondary loops through migratory flight down the west coast of Africa. Lines of belonging follow them from the settled village outward, not to anywhere in general, but to those edges where White and his fellow parishioners and expert witnesses have reason to think the hirundines may go during the winter months. These lines of belonging, pathways tracking local life's persistence, turn out to double as lines of commemoration, routes acknowledging local life's destruction and loss, once the birds that reappear in Selborne are marked with the reality of how many don't make it back each year, at least not in their own bodies. All the possible points where the hirundines moved and where most of them died, scattered across Hampshire or across West Africa, or at numerous points in between, secure their place as extensions of Selborne in the mental, in a kind of mental map. They secure their place as these mental maps are ritually redrawn, out and back again, season on season and year on year, in a rhythm at once properly scientific and consistently liturgical. Far from all of White's favorite birds return, but death itself can't keep the loops from closing, arriving back where they started, thanks to the way White builds religious concepts, in this case incarnation, into practices of spatial extension. A long distance closeness that comes from indispensability can persist for as long as a few birds keep appearing, keep rising each Easter. Now that last line is meant to sound a note of guarded optimism, keeping some of the piety, but stripping it down as much as I can. But I should tell you that the piece I'm describing for you closes by reflecting on what's left out as a consequence of White's special fondness for certain indispensable birds. Here I start with Virginia Woolf's quip from 1939, that Gilbert White is, I'm quoting, far less tender with the poor of his parish than with, quoting again, the grasshopper whom he lifts out its hole so carefully. Her notion that White lacked affection for poor people doesn't stand up to the scrutiny of Richard Maby's modern biography. But Woolf was right to wonder about the exclusions that White's care for other than human life entails. The assumption that some, but not all non-human beings can be favorites. The assumption perhaps that not all non-human beings can be saved or resurrected forms part of Gilbert White's religious and ecological legacy too. Now let me glance in the chat.
think we're all still stunned and filled with admiration. Can we take a moment to give Dustin a round of applause, either virtually with icons or with physical hands? And then I will type a question in the chat and I will call on you or lift your hand icon directly. I'll take you off speaker view, gallery view, so I can see if there are any hands up. Rebecca, you've raised your hand. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Hi, Dustin. That was great. Thank you. My question is still sort of half formed, so hopefully it will come out in a way that makes sense. But I thought that this was a really fascinating way to imagine a naturalist relationship to space. But I was also reflecting on how different it is from, and how different of a conceptual model it is from almost the complete inverse of what you're talking about, which is the traveler who would go somewhere like the places where these birds would go and have the kind of like reputation of representing things like birds as very frozen in space and frozen in time through Royal Society style kind of like rules for travelers lists and stuff like that, or even bringing them home to like freeze them in curiosity cabinets or repositories or something like that. And so I think that the temptation for me was to fall into that binary of like this ecclesiastical model being different from the kind of like empirical models of naturalism that are rising up across the 18th century. But it also seemed like you were really wanting to trouble that binary. I was wondering if you could put White in conversation with these other kinds of naturalist trends that are happening during the time. Do you see this as something that kind of like scales out and informs the way that we think about what naturalism meant in the 18th century and how spatiality and motion and everything like that was such an important piece of comprising the 18th century worldview, if I can say that there even is such a thing? Or do you think that he was doing something kind of like insular and distinct that is very much kind of like tied to his own locality and his own location that doesn't really scale out? Does that question make sense?
It does. I'm wrapped by the question itself, and I'm reluctant to answer because it won't do it justice. But what I want to hold on to are a couple of things. One, the idea that White's spatial model is predicated on bird motion, the idea that these birds move rather than being frozen still as examinable models, as specimens. Of course, he's working with specimens and asks plenty of people to send him specimens, and he also himself moves around the area when people have one and they can show him a bird that demands his attention. But I think your question gives me a way of thinking that something about his efforts to kind of mobilize or maybe operationalize certain like religious terms and concepts requires a kind of field naturalist model, being out in the world, looking, digging, using the telescope, climbing trees, poking around on the top of church spires and that sort of thing, as opposed to the collector's model, where the real work, the real identification, the real analysis and understanding happens indoors, happens happens inside. So I do think, even though White's certainly like not, I wouldn't want to put him in like strong opposition to the Royal Society model in other ways, but I think this sense that bird motion, bird movement is an open question, an unresolved one, and it itself makes these birds and their motions kind of entangled with human attempts to understand them. Where that brings me back to the epistolary format of the text, right? The ideas being exchanged in themselves, moving, observations and notices moving around. I think that's a familiar model in other sort of natural scientific contexts, but yeah, I do think here the sense that they're together on a loop in some way, does seem different. Whether it's tied particularly to Selborne, I don't know. There is I didn't share it in this version of the material. There is a specific connection with Gilbert White's brother John, who happens to be in Gibraltar, who's kind of a ne'er-do-well type who ends up with a position as a chaplain in Gibraltar. And John White becomes Gilbert's main informant about birds crossing the channel and in vast numbers too. So there is something I think specific about his own position, his own station, and his own, personal connections with people who can help him to imagine, in one sense, to imagine migration as thinkable, to imagine Africa as sort of closer than in his head it actually feels. Yeah, I'll stop there, but your question has given me a lot to chew on.
Yeah, thanks. That was great.
Vivian had a comment about Wolfe and Forster. Vivian, do you want to share that?
Sure. Hi, Dustin. How are you?
I'm good.
So I really like what you said at the end, and I'm going to be thinking about like the Royal Society and Hooke and all of that. But when you talked about how he was more interested possibly in grasshoppers, I had to think, of course, about Mr. Sorley in E.M. Forster's A Passage to India, when he's having that argument on the train about any creature with a loving heart will be granted access to God's mansion, he calls it. But then they start asking him about lesser creatures, it goes down to like, what about jackals? What about cacti? What about, and I just think it's really interesting to compare that to what you're talking about here, when there seems to be like the opposite, like if he's actually valuing a grasshopper more than, people. So I was just wondering, especially knowing that Wolfe and Forster were really good friends, it just seems to be a really interesting way to approach this.
Yeah, and I think, it is to me interesting that she singles out grasshoppers, which, I think the birds, it would make sense to me if she chose a tortoise, there are other animals that for me are the go-to creatures from White, higher up on the list before I get to grasshoppers. But the idea that there might be some kind of list, the idea that White's attention and affection might be categorized in that way and can't be equally distributed is the thing I'm trying to drive at there. Like if White represents an interesting alternative model that can make room for non-human creatures as indispensable, that can be part of the place even when they're away, by virtue of extending the place in the mind or the imagination, sometimes in the law. If that's right, I nonetheless don't think that it can extend to all creatures, great or small, right? There's some kind of logic of choosing, logic of selection, or of the favorite that's involved here. And I'm kind of wrestling with and trying to learn from Bruno Latour on the process by which a collective constitutes itself as a collective by identifying its place and what's indispensable to that place. So some of the play with indispensability in the talk is in specific engagement with Latour. I do think the one difference, right, is that Latour gives you the impression that you can keep adding things to the list, right? It's just a list or a table. And I think the fact that for White, it demands time, it demands narrative space in his letters that he can't give or apportion equally. I don't know, it brings me back to the sense that it's not an indefinite list. It's not simply the case that you can keep naming new things that are indispensable, because that's not the way indispensability seems to work. So I am thinking about the exclusions involved in care at the end. Yeah.
I think we have time for at least one more question. Ali Kipe has a really interesting question about the lines of tracking and lines of commemoration.
Thank you for the really great talk. Yeah, I was wondering whether you could say a little more about how White felt when he was tracking the birds, right? And I was just wondering, is it like, did he feel that sense of like empiricist, devotion that Courtney kind of talks about in her book, or is it, objectivity or, the grief, that comes from commemoration. So, if you could say a little more about that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one bit that I did not include for reasons of time here is that Keith Snell, the historian on whom I'm leaning and thinking about conceptualizations of the parish and its flexibility in the time period, he actually singles out White's attempts to track and discover and find these birds in their possible hibernating places, or also even their nests. He seems to see it as a kind, well, he explicitly sees it as a kind of policing, that there's a kind of nefarious motive that can be glimpsed here. He compares it to a local warden on the beat for the parish poor, looking to kind of rough them up or make sure that they have their papers or something like that. I don't think effectively, I don't think emotively, in terms of the feelings involved, that's quite right. I take the point that there is indeed a kind of intensity, a kind of assertiveness to the process of seeking, trying to find, continuing to burrow and dig and climb and look for all these things. I don't know about on this point, I don't know about muted grief. I think there's a sense of like disappointment that can shade into further curiosity, because White's pretty sure that he understands how these birds go about their lives. I think he's pretty sure that he understands the logic or the rhythms of their year and their lives, whether staying or going. And so I think he's frustrated by the fact that sometimes when he wants to see them in action, he can't. But that he's able to sort of fold that into, I would say he's able to fold that into his sense of them, that they're crafty, right? This idea that they don't want to be found is part of who they are. It's not a failure of his own efforts. But I think that's sort of what I was getting at when I said that he's, for some of these birds, seems to need the distance they need from him. Obviously, they don't want to be found, but for him, that's part of the challenge and part of the rapport that he develops with them. In the background, there is a sense that these two versions of the bird that he likes are less lovable, less enjoyable, less cuddly than the ones that nest closer to human spaces, that nest in chimneys or just on the outside wall of houses. And what I'm trying to get at there is that there's the White doesn't write off the ones that keep their distance. In fact, he needs to traverse that distance. And that impulse to traverse, to look, to find, to commune, even if they can't congregate, is a basis for a larger impulse to imagine the parish as itself flexible and extendable. But that involves granting them some power over, like, determining the shape of the place, the contours of what the territory is.
If there aren't any other questions, I might steal Chair's privilege, because I was really, really struck by the kind of modern biographer Naseby, I think it was, kind of getting, I say, migratory birds can't be parishioners, right? They're migratory. They don't belong to the place. They're moving through, and lots of them are moving through. They're not settled. But in a way, it felt like your argument is that Gilbert White is refuting the idea that a migrant can't also be a parishioner. And I was just wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on the idea of the secondary loop and the expansiveness of the parish or of home to include those who are just passing through, whether in kind of national or even kind of, we are all but travelers in a, I suppose, sort of way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. The modern biographer, who's also an accomplished naturalist and nature writer himself, Richard Mabey, I've given my sense that White is refusing to commit just to decide between migration and hibernation. I love the fact that his major biography is written by someone called Maybe. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Could be both. Yeah, I think there's a stringency of an assumption that bird mobility surpasses and refuses to be, condensed within parish boundaries. That parishes aren't the sort of things that can accommodate beings that refuse to stay in a single place, that move in the way that these birds do. But my sense there, my response is that White's more attuned to movement and trying to account for movement and thinking about what a parish is. Yeah, he definitely wants to make a way for migrants, either human or non-human, to be parishioners, either up close or from afar. I think the thing about the secondary loop that I'm trying to build in, which catches some of the old nastiness associated with the idea of the parish or parochialism, is that defensiveness, right? That outsiders can't come in, the outsiders don't belong. This isn't as nasty a picture as that, but it does still emphasize the importance of ongoing communication or mutual recognition between those who are, at home and those who are away. So those who are just passing through might not count as migrants in this sense, as potential parishioners on the go, because they haven't established the relations that would need to be set up and would need to persist across that time of absence, right? So it's not just I'm here and then I'm elsewhere, but I'm still in my place. It's that depends on a certain kind of ongoing interaction or mutual relation. And that's tracked in this piece, that's tracked with White's ongoing communications about these birds. Something doesn't just automatically stay indispensable. I guess I'm saying it needs that indispensability needs to be consistently enacted. And that's where an element of ritual or liturgy, I think, comes into White's way of thinking about this.
Thank you so much. And our time is just at an end. I know people have been dashing off to teach. Thank you so much for joining us. Can we just give one last round of applause?
Thanks to all of you, really, for being here at a difficult time. I'm really grateful.
And thank you for bearing with us as we had to reschedule this. Please do join us next month when we welcome Ross Carroll to speak to us for ODSECS 20. And hopefully I'll see you all in about 4 weeks' time. Thank you and good night. Thank you, Dustin. That was fantastic. He's already gone. Thank you, Courtney. Did you get?
My Wi-Fi went out. I'm so sorry, but I'm back.
That was such a beautiful introduction. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.